I'm Meseret Hailu. I'm an assistant professor of higher and postsecondary education here at the Mary Lou Fulton Teachers College at Arizona State University. And my research, broadly speaking, is about how higher education institutions keep minoritized women in STEM pathways and professions. The issues that a lot of minoritized women face, in particular Black women, in their pursuit of undergraduate engineering education are really ecological. So issues of financial aid access, issues of adequate K-12 preparation, access to the required math and science courses. I would also say that a lot of challenges occur once women get to college and even once they enter higher education spaces, whether that be microaggressions from faculty in classrooms, racial microaggressions and stereotyping coming from classmates, issues with limited mentorship and access to industry experience once they're in college, as they make the transition either to graduate school or to industry. So even though it's not a singular issue, that we see a lot of disparities existing along the lines of race, gender, and also class in the United States for students in pursuit of STEM broadly and engineering specifically. A lot of the issues that Black women in engineering face and Black immigrant women in particular face are multidimensional and complex. So it's only natural that a lot of the solutions that should be put in place by higher education stakeholders and policymakers should be equally multifaceted and complex. And so from my research, some of the major things that I've noticed over the years is that community and what higher education scholars refer to as habitus really matters. So this idea that engineering students, Black immigrant women engineering students, are not in isolation in classrooms, creating any sort of cohort or community models makes a really big difference in making sure women enter the field of engineering and stick to it as well. Also creating connections between women and faculty mentors, women and representatives from engineering industry also really makes a difference. And so thinking about how the interplay between the individual and the institution in which they're pursuing engineering really makes a difference. And so if you think about what systems can be put in place at both the individual, right, to support students as they seek out tutoring support or making sure that faculty are not enacting microaggressions in class, all the way to thinking about how financial aid is implemented more broadly. All of these factors contribute to whether Black female students who of an immigrant background are able to get into engineering and persist throughout it as well. In terms of how higher education institutions can leverage this information, I think universities have a really valuable opportunity to make sure that they're contributing to a more diverse engineering workforce by thinking about cluster hires for faculty, particularly faculty of color, particularly Black faculty, even more pointedly, thinking about connections that we can make early on for engineering students with engineering practitioners and industry representatives. All of these things really help contribute to this strong and resilient in what researchers have referred to as engineering identity, right? So that students are able to see themselves as doers of engineering and knowledge makers and problem solvers. It's really important to think about the interplay of institutional factors and individual factors and how those interactions really shape opportunities for students. I do research both in the United States, working with primarily Black immigrant and refugee populations, and I also do research in Eastern Africa, specifically Uganda, Kenya, and Rwanda, as well as Ethiopia, which is where I'm originally from. In these places, higher education institutions and the economic development priorities of countries are really intertwined. Oftentimes, governments really see higher education as both an engine and as a mechanism for economic growth. So a lot of the equity initiatives in these places are inextricably linked to the needs of the labor market and to the economic development priorities of each particular country. So that being said, we see a lot of higher education policies that are designed to get women into more technical expertise so that they can get competitive engineering jobs once they leave college and then also contribute to the broader economy of that country. That's one major thing I've seen in terms of policy development and higher education priorities in my international work. When we think about effective strategies and approaches that higher education institutions in these settings have implemented, I think the higher education policies that really think about women's intersectional positioning is really important. If you think about a woman in Kenya, for example, where I do some of my research, if you think about her higher education access, if she's a woman from an urban center, from a high socioeconomic class, from a ethnic group that has historically had a lot of privileges in that country, versus a woman who is from rural part of the region, maybe socioeconomically disadvantaged, from a historically marginalized ethnic group, I think you'll see very different outcomes for women, even though they're both women. And so I think higher education policies that are really responsive to different people's positioning is really important. And then I think it's also really important that higher education policies that are also responsive to histories and the cultural and historical reality of a certain place tend to be more successful than a one-size-fits-all policy that's, promoted from like a large funding organization or from a large lending organization like the World Bank, for example. So in the example of Kenya that I just gave, we see that I mentioned ethnicity as an important thing to consider when designing higher education policy. In Rwanda, where I also do my research, it would be inappropriate to ask about ethnicity or to consider ethnicity in policy design because of the history of ethnic conflict in that country. So I think when we think about higher education policies that are effective in these places, they are most effective when they are responsive to intersectional positioning of women, as discussed by Crenshaw, and also when they're historically and culturally responsive as well. There are definitely some differences in how higher education institutions in Eastern Africa and the United States conceptualize and implement equity initiatives in STEM higher education. The largest of these would definitely be the role of race and how we think about racial equity in higher education institutions. So in the United States, it's very discussing race and thinking about how race shapes educational opportunity is really common and something that a lot of education researchers, myself included, think about when we're writing and researching. In Eastern Africa, where I do some of my work, race doesn't operate in the same way because of the demographic composition of these countries, right? So race may not be as salient as ethnicity or as class or geography in these places. So I think what that difference shows us is the importance of being really responsive to cultural and historical context in each place and making sure the research questions we're asking and the policy recommendations and equity initiatives we're designing based on our research are both responsive to that sort of history and context. So when I think about ways to support women, minoritized women in STEM pathways, both in the US and in Eastern Africa, I think at the smaller scale, when we think about individual interactions and sort of like the individual student, I think an easy place to start, or an important place to start rather, is thinking about pedagogy and how we can make these higher education classrooms that are focused on STEM less competitive, more collaborative, thinking about how we could take advantage of problem-based learning and team-based learning and decreasing this hyper-competitive nature of a lot of these engineering classrooms where historically we've seen difficulty in being able to weed out students as a mark of a really elite major or a really competitive field. And I think in order to have the sort of technological and engineering innovations that we seek to solve some of our society's largest problems, we need a diverse workforce that sees their work and their field as a public good and as something that's contributing to the betterment of society and not just to their individual well-being or their individual benefits or career development. So I think that pedagogy and making sure that we teach STEM and engineering specifically in such a way that it's collaborative, not hyper-competitive, and designed to respond to society's problems, I think that's an easy way that institutions in both the United States and in Eastern Africa where I work can make higher education, STEM higher education, engineering higher education more inclusive. I think another thing that's become a perennial issue in both settings is also this issue of college affordability. Now, this looks really differently in Ethiopia, Kenya, Rwanda versus the United States because college affordability and the economic conditions vary in both regions of the world. College affordability and the rising costs of university education are a concern of students in both settings. And I recognize that this is a concern for probably all students, not just those pursuing a STEM degree. But as a STEM education researcher, I've seen this come up a lot in the interviews that I do with students and the ethnographic research that I'm pursuing. People are really stressed about their ability to cover the costs of their education, which might discourage them from pursuing higher education in general. So I think that's something that we need to take seriously as we're moving forward if we are thinking about how to make STEM higher education a really sustainable pursuit for students moving forward.